Well, hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, it's part 4 of our Toys and Joys dump truck and pup trailer build. Well, this build is going much slower than what I really wanted it to go. I really wanted this series to be a little faster paced. But in order to provide as much information as I can, it's kind of slowing it down a bit. But I'm okay with that. If you guys are okay with that, then I'm okay with it. And we can move on and carry on with the build for today. Well, this picture here is quite possibly one of the most deceiving pictures I've ever seen. It gives the impression that you need to drill the hole at an angle. But truth be told, let me just rotate this a bit here and you can see this is nothing more than a straight up and down hole right through the center of our fuel tank. So let's head over to the drill press and I'll show you how you can set this up. Well, in order to drill these holes, you need a very simple drilling jig. And what I've done is I've cut a piece of scrap plywood. It doesn't really matter the size as long as it is wider than what your fuel tanks are. So guys, you want to mark the center and transfer that mark onto the end. And at this point, you'll take it over to your table saw. You'll set the height of your blade to be somewhere around half the thickness of your piece of plywood. And then you'll set your fence to be somewhere close to the middle. You'll make a pass. You can rotate your piece 180 degrees and make a second pass, and that will provide you with a perfectly centered dado. From there, you can move your fence out little by little, testing every once in a while. And you want to stop when you have it so that your fuel tank will sit comfortably in that groove without rocking back and forth. And that is basically the drilling jig, guys. It's just a dado on a scrap of plywood. So we have transferred that center mark to the back of our board. And what you want to do is you want to set your fence so that your bit strikes right at that center line. Once you get that set up, we're going to do a test drilling at that center mark. It doesn't even have to be right through. We just want to make sure that the center is lined up with our line. Well, from there, you can sit your jig up against the fence and take your tank. Now, I've done a little bit of a laser embellishment on mine with diesel fuel only, just a small little embellishment, and I've placed a center line here exactly in the middle of our tank. We're going to set our depth stop so that it will drill 3/4 of an inch deep into our tank, and at that point we can rotate it however we see fit. I'm thinking about there, and then you can just drill your hole, and that's all there is to it, guys. And there is your angled hole out the top of the fuel tank. So we now want to make the caps for these. Let me show you how we're going to do that. Well, there's not really any information or much information here on the prints for this gas cap other than the fact that it is a 5/32 inch axle peg that is 5/8 of an inch long. That really doesn't help me because I make all my own parts. So guys, I'm going to show you how to make the axle pegs. This is the same process as what I used for the wheels. So when we get to the wheels and I say to you, make some axle pegs, you can refer back here to part 4 and you can follow this procedure. So what I've done is I've set my fence and I have set my stop block here so that I am drilling about 3/8 of an inch in from the edge of this piece of maple. Guys, I have my 5/32 diameter drill bit here, and I've set the depth stop to be about halfway down through our piece of maple, which in this case is 1/4 of an inch thick. So the drill bit size will be the same as what your axle pin has to be. So if you're trying to do a 1/4 inch axle pin, it's a 1/4 inch bit. If you're going to do a 5/16 bit, etc., etc. So the first thing we want to do is drill this first hole here with our stock tight against our stop block and against our fence. Okay, that's the first step. Now, turn your piece around up against the stop block and up against the fence and drill another hole.
And then we will rotate it and drill another hole. And then once again, spin it around 180 degrees up against the stop, up against your fence, and drill the last hole. Now, truth be told, I only need 2 of these axle pins for the diesel caps, but sometimes they mess up. So you want to give yourself a little extra. So at this point now, do not change any of your settings. About the only setting you may need to change, or that you can change, is your depth stop. You can open it all the way up because we don't want this to be a stop drill at this point. And now you can install a 3/8 diameter plug cutter. Remember, I use these for the tail lights, so they also do great for these axle pins. So what you want to do is make sure that you have your hole lined up properly, up against the stop and up against the fence, and we're going to drill right through this 1/4 inch stock. And once it breaks through your stock, you end up with the end of your axle pin. Now, guys, do the other 3 and then join me over at the bench. Okay, and what we'll do is on the side of our hole on each of our caps, we're just going to drag it a few times along with the grain to just take off any rough edges that there might be. That looks pretty good. I wouldn't worry too much about it, guys. Like, don't go crazy, because we're going to have to sand these after we get our pins glued in. Now, what you want to do, I have 4 small pieces of 5/32 diameter dowel. They are about 13/16 of an inch long, and we're just going to apply a little bit of glue to each one and then tap them into the caps that we drilled, making sure that they're square, guys. You don't want these to go in crooked, and then put that aside and let it completely dry. Okay, so these are dried up now, and now it's time to shape them. Guys, we're just going to chuck them up in a cordless drill, just gently. You don't need to really crank these in. Just go gentle, and we're going to spin them and then use sandpaper to shape them the way that we want. Now, truth be told, when you look at the axle pin that it shows in the drawing, there is a chamfer there. So we can take one of our sanding blocks and give it that chamfer. Now, it's hard to tell without any kind of reference to size, because I don't have one of these and they're really not showing one clearly on the drawing. So it's hard to tell exactly what size I should be making this to. But guys, just use your best judgment. Look what it looks like and see what's proportionate. And if you're happy with that shape, then we can glue that part into our tank. Now guys, I like to leave mine with a little bit of gap here just to make it look more like an actual fuel cap. But either way, get your other ones done and you can glue those in as well. You've got 4 chances here to get it right, so do your best. We've also turned the air tank, as I said, same procedure as the fuel tanks. But guys, if you remember, we had those spacers on that front axle. We had the 2 spares, and while I was over at the lathe turning down the air tank anyway, I figured I'd turn these down to their size of 3/4 inch in diameter. So there we go, we have the spacers for our drop down axle assembly done. So seeing that we have that finished, we might as well make the axle for it next. We can see here on sheet 5 that the drop down axle is nothing more than a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch by 3 inch long piece of stock. And in fact, we're going to use some leftover 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch walnut that we used for the front axle. So all we need to do is, it's the same procedure as the front. The main difference here is that there is no notch cut out like the front axle. So we're just going to mark our centers. We're going to drill our holes to a depth of 1 1/8. Again, guys, because this is not a through hole for the axle, I do stopped holes at 1/4 inch to coincide with my pen mandrels so that everything matches. So instead of a 5/16 hole, I will be drilling a 1/4 inch hole, 1 1/8 deep in both ends, and then we're going to take it over to the router table, and just like we did with the other one, we're going to use a 1/8 inch round over, not the 1/16 that they're calling for because I don't have that bit. So a 1/8 inch round over on all 4 sides, and then this axle is then complete. Well, we have our axle and our spacers done, so now if we're going to carry on with this drop-down axle assembly, the next thing we want to do are the drop-down axle hinge. Now, this is a bit of a tricky piece, but what I have is a piece of 3/8 thick walnut, and I've cut it to a width of 5/8 of an inch. It is much longer than we need, and that will give us the room to be able to do the work that we need to do on the table saw. And the very first thing we want to do is we want to cut this rabbet out of the one side here. Now that rabbet is going to be 3/16 of an inch by 1/4 of an inch, and that will be in the corner of each one of our pieces. So we just need to mark it once here. We'll set it up on the table saw, raising our blade to a height of 1/4 inch, and we will cut these rabbets out of our longer pieces. We now want to mark for this slope, and for that we're going to place a mark on the top of our piece here at 1/2 inch in from the end, just like that. And then the bottom will be sloped until the end of our stock here is 1/8 of an inch thick. So we're going to place that mark as well. And then if we join those 2 lines on our 3/8 side, we will end up with the slope drawn out on our stock. We can also square off that 1/2 inch line at the top, and we will add a line at 3/8 of an inch right across the front here, so that that will complete our markings on this piece. So now how do we cut this? We need to make a left and a right, so there's something you want to keep in mind right off the bat. You're going to need to make opposites of this. So what we're going to do is I'm going to turn this up on edge. We have our guideline here for our angle. I'm going to clamp this down, and very carefully with a fine-tooth saw, I'm going to cut down until I reach this edge here at 3/8 of an inch. And once you get that done, we're going to very carefully clamp this down again, and on that line on the top surface, right at the edge of our rabbet, we're going to very carefully cut on an angle until our lines meet up and this piece releases, just like that. Guys, it's a slow cut. Just take your time. And if you take your time, you'll get a beautiful little result like that. Check that out. All this needs now is our little sanding block in here to clean it up just a little. And then once you get a left and a right made of this, you can move on to your next step. Okay, and there we have a left and a right. Guys, I'm going to take this over to the table saw now, and we're going to cross cut this using our miter fence to its final length of 2 inches. And then I'll show you where to go from there. Well, the next step we're going to take is we're going to do the rest of the marking and the layout on this. So we're going to mark this dado here, 3/8 of an inch wide, 5/8 of an inch deep, and that will be marked on the 5/8 wide side. So we're going to mark it on both of these pieces. We will mark on the 3/8 side our 5/32 diameter hole here. And once we get that done, we're actually going to take this over to the table saw, and these chamfers here at 1/16, 45 degrees, we are going to run these through the table saw to cut those chamfers off, much like what we did, guys, with some of the other pieces where we held them with our little awl. And I'll just show you that here. There's the little awl that I hold it with. It can keep your fingers away from the blade, and the cut is so minute. It's just barely kissing that wood. There is no draw on this to pull it into the blade, so the awl can easily hold it. So we're going to cut those chamfers, we're going to drill that hole, and then we're going to take this over to the scroll saw and we're going to cut out that dado that's in the middle of our pieces. And before too long, you'll have these two pieces done. Guys, I know the pieces look difficult, but if you just take your time and go through the steps, you'll find that it's really not as hard as what these pieces look. You just sort of got to think about the process, and as I've said before, try to make as many cuts as you can while the entire piece is in its form with straight and square edges. It'll make it a lot easier on you. Now guys, the next pieces that we're going to make here will be these drop-down risers, the drop-down axle supports, and the drop-down lock block. Once again guys, these are not difficult pieces to make. The key is to cut them to their dimensions, giving yourself extra length, and for the angles, we're going to sand these angles or cut them if they're just a 45, and then cut them to length using the miter box, just like we did the other small parts on page 2. So I'm not going to go through the process of this. We've shown exactly how to do these tiny parts on page 2. So I'm going to get those pieces made, and then we're going to assemble this entire drop-down axle assembly. Guys, we're going to put together this drop-down axle assembly, and honestly, the key to a good assembly is preparedness. You need to have things together. Setup blocks, if you have them, and squares are a great help. They really are. A good straight edge here. Anything that you can use to help you align pieces, as well as some water and some cotton swabs to wipe away squeeze out, especially on small parts. Now guys, if we look at this, there really isn't that much guidance, so we have to take our information wherever we can get it. And in a lot of cases, this stuff is one-to-one drawings. So we can scale off the drawings in a lot of cases. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with our drop-down axle hinge and our drop-down riser. And we're going to put those pieces in place. Now you want to make sure that when you're gluing it in place, that your 45 chamfer that you cut down here is facing out, away from your holes. It'll be this way. So there's really not much guidance, but if we scale off this area right here, this is 13/16 of an inch. So what I have here is 11/16 plus a 1/8 inch spacer. We can lay those against a flat edge, and once we get our glue applied, we can sit our riser right in here, push this in and glue it using our setup blocks as a square edge against our pieces to hold it squarely, and as well to get the proper spacing to have it stick out the top the proper amount. So I'm going to glue this one piece in using my setup blocks and my steel straight edge here on a flat board for assembly, and I'll show you how this kind of goes. So we're going to hold that in place for just a minute, and while we have that held in place, we'll get a cotton swab, dip it in the water, squeeze out the excess because you don't want it diluting any of the glue. Hold it in place, and we're just going to gently swipe away the excess squeeze out here as best we can. And then before continuing on, we will wipe out any other of the squeeze out, and we're just going to put this aside and let it dry. Don't touch it. Don't do anything else to it, because we don't want to bump it out of whack while we're manhandling it, putting on the other components to these pieces. So just clean up your squeeze out, then you can put it up against your setup blocks to double check that nothing has shifted, and then leave it alone. And then we can do the exact same assembly for our other side. Well, the next piece that we want to glue on will be these drop-down lock blocks, these tiny little angled pieces. Now guys, it's easy to set these up. If you look here, it says that they're 3/8 of an inch up from the bottom of our drop-down axle hinge. And as long as you measured the drop-down riser, as long as this is in the correct position, it's very easy to set the other piece up. So I have a 1/4 inch setup block here because this is a 1/4 inch thick. there's a 1/2 inch between the base of the hinge and the bottom of this riser, and that just happens to be how big the setup block is. But the 1/4 inch will give positive support all the way across at the level of this riser. We're then just going to take another setup block. It doesn't matter what size, because all it's for is to give us a platform, and that platform will be to place our 3/8 of an inch setup block right there. Now by doing that, we have now created 3/8 of an inch from the bottom of our hinge to the top, and we can just place some glue on our lock blocks and then just slide them into place right here. Hold them just like we did before until the glue has a chance to set up a little bit, and then clean up the squeeze out and let them completely dry as well. Well, it's now time to mount our axle hinges onto the actual drop-down axle. Now, if we look at the assembly drawing here, guys, or what is perceived as the assembly drawing, we have 3/4 of an inch in between these two pieces. Those two pieces, being our drop-down hinges, are 5/8 of an inch each. If we add together 5/8, 5/8, and 3/4, we end up with 2 inches, which means, because our axle is 3 inches, that means that we have a 1/2 inch in from either edge to place our axle hinges. So I have placed a mark here, 1/2 inch in from each side, and then a 5/8 of an inch in from each of those marks, just as a guideline. So what I've got here is a little 2-inch square. I'm going to place my axle on a little 1/16 inch spacer just to raise it off of the assembly board just a little bit, and we're going to glue on our first hinge. You just want to make sure that you reference this drawing here so that you know which one you're putting on. There is a left and a right. You don't want to mix them up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a little bit of glue on the interior here. You don't need a lot. And we're going to put our 1/2 inch spacer against our steel straight edge here, and using our square to ensure that everything is square to the steel edge, etc., etc., we're going to push this in place using our 1/2 inch setup block to get the proper distance from the end. All right, that looks pretty good there. Nice and straight, it's nice and square. If your setup is true on your tools, guys, a lot of this squareness is going to come automatically. So you can see we have quite a bit of squeeze out here on this piece. Not a problem. We'll use the cotton swab, clean it up, and then we can repeat the process on the hinge for the opposite side of our axle. Now, did you see that there, guys? I just shifted this whole thing by accident. So now I have to reset it with our setup blocks to make sure that it is correct. So that's something you really want to keep an eye on. It can be very finicky to put these pieces together. Just take your time and make sure that your setup is right. Because in a lot of cases, after all the work you've put into that one piece there, that axle hinge, you won't get a second shot at trying to make this right. And before things are completely set, you just want to get a square and verify that your parts are perfectly square to your axle. Things like this in assembly, guys, are just imperative when it comes to models like this. So leave this alone now, just like I've said before. Let this dry up so that we can work on the other pieces without the worry of shifting something or throwing something out of whack. So just let that set up. And once you're happy with the fact that it's set up and you're good, then we can mount the other one on the opposite side in the same fashion. Once you get that done, guys, you just want to verify that you have your 3/4 of an inch in between these two pieces.
And once again, we're out of time. Like, where does the time go? These shows go by so quickly. There is a lot of time spent in the shop working on pieces to be able to produce one show, and there is a ton of time spent in editing to try to get it So that not only does it look good, but it doesn't leave any open ends. It leaves you guys with the answers that you need, hopefully, before you ever have to ask the questions. Guys, this one is really plugging along. We are getting there. It takes time. There's nothing more I can say about that other than these model builds take time. And if you're in a rush and you think these shows are slow paced and you want it to go faster and faster and faster, maybe you don't have the patience it takes to make one of these, because you really need to pack your patience when you're making one of these models, guys. Either way, if you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. We have an amazing audience base, and I hope that you're going to consider becoming a part of that. Guys, I want to thank you so much for tuning in to this week's show. I hope you've been enjoying the build series so far. I hope that you're following along at home with your own sets of plans and having some fun on your end of things, not just sitting in your armchair watching me do it. And more importantly, guys, I hope you're going to join me again next week when I bring you yet another woodworking video.